Hi, everyone, and welcome to our week number 6 overview. So, let me just spend a few minutes talking about a few of the main topics that we're going to cover this week. Then I'll go through some of the resources that have been provided for you in terms of textbook material as well as videos. And then we'll take a look at some of the assignments that you'll be doing in this week. So, up to this point in time in the class, we've been looking at ethics primarily from an individualistic type of position. We've been looking primarily at how one ensures their own ethics, how one builds his or her own ethical principles, how he or she then adheres to the code of ethics of an organization. But this week, we're going to turn our attention to looking more at the mechanisms that are placed upon individual employees in order to enforce and ensure compliance with ethical principles. So we're looking at ways in which we impose these ethical controls as a society. There are two main categories of these types of controls. There are transparency-oriented types of controls and then conflict of interest types of controls. So in terms of transparency types of controls, obviously we have a variety of sunshine laws at the federal as well as the state level to try and make the public's business apparent and transparent to the public. So at the federal level, we have transparency laws such as FOIA requests, Freedom of Information Act requests. So as a member of the public, you can submit a FOIA request to get access to government documents, government communication, to give you a little bit of insight into the decision-making process behind policy and procedural types of decisions. Now, the whole idea of transparency and FOIA requests really took on a great deal of prominence in the Senate impeachment trial of President Trump. We saw while that trial was going on, some of the documents that the House of Representatives had requested and had been blocked by the White House. Some of those documents ended up being released during the course of the trial, not being released because of the request from the House, but rather being released to watchdog groups that had submitted these FOIA requests. And so through those FOIA requests, we got some access to emails and some conversations that otherwise the public was not aware of and didn't even know that they existed. So FOIA requests can be very useful in terms of getting this type of information out of the federal government. Here in the state of California, we have our own version of FOIA requests, and those are what are called public record requests. And public record requests come out of the California Public Records Act. You'll see later on that I provided for you a PowerPoint presentation on the California Public Records Act. But with these public record requests, what members of the public can do is they can submit a public records request, a PRR, to a state or to a local agency, demanding that that state or that local agency release documents and release communications. Now, the burden that is imposed upon a government when it receives a PRR is that there is a mandated turnaround time whereby that agency must turn that information over or must indicate to the requester that that information is not covered under the California Public Records Act. So there is some information that is not covered under the Public Records Act that governments do not need to turn over. So if it's information that's dealing with ongoing litigation, sometimes that information will not be subject to a public records request. If there's communication between a governmental entity or members of that entity and their legal counsel, that's oftentimes covered under attorney-client privilege, and that information will not be readily discoverable under a public records request. So there are personnel records, for instance, are sometimes difficult to get through a PRR just because obviously they're personnel records. So there are some exemptions and there are some limitations. However, there's a recent court case here in California, somewhat recent, the San Jose case, that has really greatly expanded the reach of the Public Records Act. And so now under that San Jose ruling, communications among, say, for instance, I serve on a local school board, and so communications that I have with any member of the district or dealing with anything within the district's jurisdiction, all of those communications are subject to disclosure, irrespective of what device those communications occurred on. So if I use my personal cell phone and I'm contacting a member of the district or another board member or discussing district related information, and I'm using my cell phone, that cell phone then becomes discoverable. So what a lot of public officials have started doing is they have started maintaining a separate phone just for their government work, and then making sure that all of the discussions and all the communications that deal with government business are all done on that one cell phone, because that will become discoverable. Your emails, if you're using personal emails to discuss government business, those personal emails then also become discoverable under a public records request. So now, as an elected official, I've lived through several of these public records requests, and so I can tell you what typically happens is the requester will submit the public records request to the governing agency. The governing agency will then need to respond to that requester to indicate whether or not they believe that the information is subject to a public records request. Typically, the agency will then engage in discussions with their legal counsel. Legal counsel will then provide some boundaries in terms of the type of communication that is discoverable. And then the agency will then have all affected members of that agency will need to search through their emails and search through their personal devices and their texts to find any of the information that is covered under that public records request, and then turn that information over to the governing agency. Obviously, it's always the best practice to use only government issued emails and email accounts for discussion of government business, because all those emails then go through the governing agency's server. And so the governing agency has direct access to all of those. If you're using a personal email account, or if you're using text messages on a personal cell phone, you'll be requested to then go through all your messages and all your emails and locate any information that could be covered under that public records request, and then submit that to the governing agency. Typically, governing agencies will request that members, once they have searched their devices for any information that's covered under the public records request, will then sign an affidavit under perjury, penalty of perjury, saying, yes, this is all the information that I have found that is pertinent to the request. So the San Jose case greatly expanded the coverage of communications that are now subject to a public records request. Governing agencies get public records requests on a very frequent basis. I know my district typically will probably get at least a couple dozen per year. They can be time consuming. They can also be costly in terms of conversations with legal counsel, but they are there to try and protect this idea of transparency, so that the public can see all the discussions and all the deliberations that they have the right to see. So transparency-oriented controls, that's one category of controls to try and enforce ethical principles. Then we also have conflict of interest. And here in the state of California, the primary tool that's used to maintain conflict of interest considerations is what's known as a Form 700. So all elected officials and many administrators, if they are in a designated position, you may have to do this given your position, will need to file a Form 700. That Form 700 requires that the filer disclose sources of income, disclose holdings and investments that they may have, disclose property that they may own other than just your primary residence, and disclose gifts and in-kind types of donations. All that needs to be disclosed on that Form 700. Again, the goal of the Form 700 is to make sure that those office holders are not being influenced in the decisions that they make by their own private interests. So the whole idea is to make sure that public interest dominates over private interest. Now, there are a lot of exemptions that are provided in this Form 700. So, for instance, income that is earned outside the jurisdiction from a employer who does not maintain a physical presence nexus within that jurisdiction, that income is exempted and does not need to be reported on the Form 700. Again, if you've got your personal property, your personal home, your primary residence, I should say, that is also exempted. Now, if you have rental properties, those rental properties, the value, the income you get from those rental properties would need to be reported on your Form 700. If you have investments, stocks, those types of things, those need to be reported as well. One of the major exemption categories is income that is earned from a government agency. And so if you're working for a government agency, you do not have to report the income that you earn from that government agency. And the reason for that is that the government agency knows what it's paying you. And so it already has that information. Gifts need to be reported. And so if you go to a dinner that is being hosted and paid for by a contractor with the city, that value of that dinner would need to be reported. So an example, serving on a school board every year, I go to the California School Boards Association conference, either in San Francisco or San Diego. And during that conference, contractors will have dinners and will have receptions, and they will invite board members to those dinners and receptions. Though the value of those dinners and receptions would need to be reported on a conflict of interest form on a Form 700. As a matter of course, I don't attend any of those, and so I like to keep a clean Form 700, and so I don't go to any receptions or any dinners or anything that's paid for by a contractor who either has a contract with the district or which be trying to get a contract with the district. And again, the whole purpose of making people report those types of gifts is because of you want to try and make sure that they're acting in the public interest when they make these decisions or when they issue these contracts, as opposed to operating in their own private interest. We don't want private corporations who have an undue influence on the decisions made by public officials. So transparency and conflict of interest are really the two broad categories that we typically use to impose controls on public officials to try and enhance the enforcement of ethical principles on those individuals. And so you'll read about those this week. You have Chapter 10 in the primary textbook, Mandating Duty, External Measures to Promote Ethics. You'll read about FOIA. You'll read about a little bit about whistleblowers again, but you'll read about some of these external measures that are used to enforce ethical principles. And then obviously you have a review of administrative ethics chapter number 2, because that again becomes relevant this week. But your primary reading will come from Chapter 10. Got some videos for you. One video is on open meeting laws. Here in the state of California, we have the Brown Act. The Brown Act requires that the government's business be conducted in public and that the public have access to the business being done by government. And so when you have these city council meetings, when you have school board meetings, those meetings must be agendized. And so an agenda must be provided at least 72 hours in advance. The meeting must be held in a publicly available place. The agenda, the governing board or the city council must only discuss those issues on the agenda. They cannot take action on any issues that are not on the agenda. You also provide a period of time for public comment. If you've been to a city council meeting, you've seen this public comment period. In my district, we afford 3 minutes per speaker, and we usually do the public comment period early in the meeting, so people don't have to sit through a 3 or 4 hour meeting just to say what they want to say. They usually only have to sit through about 15 or 20 minutes before they have the opportunity to speak. That's all within the Brown Act. Uh, you have open sessions, you have closed sessions. So you can have a closed session where the public does not attend, but you can only do that for a limited number of reasons. And so to deal with personnel matters, to deal with personnel contracts, to deal with discussions with legal counsel, personnel evaluations, those types of confidential topics are allowed to be done in closed session. Most everything else, though, must be transacted in open session. What goes on in closed session cannot be communicated to the public, and so that is confidential information. But again, 99.9% of what you do as a governing authority, most of that is done in open session here in California as a result of the Brown Act. The Brown Act has a lot of stipulations for the definition of a meeting, what constitutes a meeting, what doesn't constitute a meeting, and how meetings are then transacted. So we've got a video on open meeting laws. You then have a video on Freedom of Information Act and those types of requests. I've also provided for you a PowerPoint presentation on the California Public Records Act, and so you'll want to take a look at that one as well, and that will guide you through some of the basics of public records requests here in the state of California. So some of your assignments for this week, so I don't make this video too terribly long. You have another one of these multimedia discussion board assignments due on Saturday. The topic for this one is the Freedom of Information Act. And so in Chapter 10, you will read about the external measures to promote ethics. One topic discussed is the Freedom of Information Act and open documents request. So what you're asked to do in this discussion board posting is to identify information that you would like to receive from a government agency, then research the rules for that jurisdiction on how to request the information, fill out the necessary forms or develop the appropriate request for the information. You don't have to send in a request for information. It's not required to actually go through the process, but at least put together the request that you would submit if you were submitting it to get this information. Now, some jurisdictions will have a form that can be filled out by requesters. Some jurisdictions don't. And so you won't find a form for that jurisdiction. So instead you would, put together what you would normally put into an email to do a public records request. But again, sending it's optional. You don't have to send it. So again, in this discussion board post, I'm hoping that you will talk about the information that you want to receive, which agency you're going to target, which agency has the information, how you would go through requesting the information. So again, you're going to do it like you do your other multimedia discussion boards, where you will narrate a PowerPoint presentation and then host that then in our discussion board forum. So that's your multimedia discussion board assignment for this week. Then you also have a written assignment, your journal assignment, due by Sunday. For the journal assignment, what I'm asking you to do is I am asking you to revisit the first journal post that you did in this class, reread that first journal post, and then after rereading that first journal post, ask yourself questions such as, how have your ideas about the application of ethical theories changed or deepened since that first post? How can you find ways to connect the theories to practical application for your work? And which theories seem to guide both your personal and professional life, or do the theories differ from work or home? That should look familiar to you, because what you're basically doing is redoing that first journal entry. It's an interesting type of assessment assignment whereby you can revisit what you thought those several weeks ago and compare it to how you are thinking now after being exposed to the material and the theories and the concepts in this class. So that is your journal assignment for this week. Then you also want to think about putting together an outline for your final paper. The outline for your final paper, oops, not there, but the outline for your final paper should just lay out the different elements of your paper, how you're going to be putting that final paper together. I did provide for you the final paper, the critical assignment guidelines, in the Ask Your Instructor area of the class. And so if you haven't looked at that yet, you'll see it in the Ask Your Instructor area. I'll provide it all for you again so that you can refer to that in then putting together this outline. But the outline, it's a week 6 outline, so it's due in week 6. It doesn't necessarily have to be turned in by the end of this week. If you want to keep working on it and keep tinkering with it before the critical assignment is due, that's fine. The 2 assignments that are due this week are the multimedia discussion board and then also the week 6 journal assignment. So those 2 are absolutely due this week. The first one on by Saturday and the second one then by Sunday. So that's about it for week number 6. If you have any questions, as always, feel free to reach out and contact me. Like I said, you do have the information on what we're looking for in that critical assignment. Also, that's provided for you as well here in week 6. So as you scroll down, you go through all the different resources. You'll see down at the bottom of the screen that I replicated the requirements for the critical assignment, so you can refer to those and use those stipulations, if you will, for putting together your outline. All right. So again, any questions, feel free to contact me. Otherwise, I hope everyone has a very good week. And I will talk to you again with our week 7 video sometime next week. So take care and have a great week.